Well, good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we read our final two chapters of Flying Against Time. How Ted Scott managed to keep his plane afloat for the next few minutes he never knew. It seemed a miracle that the structure was not ripped apart. One less stout and well constructed would never have outlived the terrible blow. As it whirled around and around to every point of the compass, it was twisting in a seemingly crazy dance of death. The wind was coming from all quarters at once. To guide the plane was impossible. All that the young aviator could hope to do was to keep it so nearly on an even keel that it would not get utterly out of his control and plunge down to the earth. He had to crouch low to prevent being blown out of the plane. He knew now what a Kansas cyclone meant. Luckily, it was as brief as it was terrible, or the young aviator could not have survived. Like a ship tossed on the billows, the Comet reeled and rocked for a few minutes on the waves of the air left as an aftermath of the storm. Then Ted gradually got it in hand. Ted's first need was to seek altitude, as the plane had been driven perilously near the earth. He pulled the stick and the plane darted upward, but he noted with anxiety that it did not shoot up with its customary ease and grace. There was something lumbering about the motion. Something was wrong. The Comet had outlived the twister, but it had not escaped the storm unscathed. Ted flashed his light about the structure. All the struts had held. The engines had not been damaged and were working as usual. He turned the glare upon the wings. The left one was untouched, but his heart sank as he noted that the right one was drooping slightly. There was a slight fracture halfway along its length, slight now, but one that he knew would steadily widen under the strain of flying. On an ordinary trip, he would have sought at once to make a landing and set about repairs, but that was forbidden by the nature of the contest. If he as much as touched the earth, he would have lost the race and all the issues depending on it. Dago Dan and his like would have triumphed just as certainly as though Ted had been bitten by a rattlesnake. There was no alternative. Although he knew it was at the risk of his life, he must repair that injured wing in midair. He lessened the speed, blocked the control, and with tools and material from his kit, climbed out on the wing of the plane. The wind caught him, and he had to hold on for dear life, flattening his body as close to the wing as he could to lessen the resistance. Inch by inch he crept forward until he had reached the injured part. Then, with infinite precaution, he set to work, holding on with one hand while he worked with the other what was possible. But there were times when he had to use both hands, and at those times he knew that it was only the toss of the dice whether he lived or died. But the fortune that favors the brave was with him, and at last his work was done. It was well done, too, for however great the temptation to hurry, he knew that his very life, as well as the successful completion of his tasks, depended upon thoroughness. It was with a sigh of relief when he again reached the cockpit and dropped into his seat. But he was amply rewarded when the plane responded to his slightest touch as readily as it had when he had taken off from Boston. Now that the strain was over, Ted had time to estimate his position and the distance he had traveled. He had a sense of dismay as he finished his calculations. The headwinds he had encountered, culminating with the encounter with the twister, and the repairs to his plane, had wiped out the surplus he had piled up in the earlier stages of the race. He no longer had anything up his sleeve. On the contrary, he was a little behind his schedule. Behind his schedule? And the Rockies still in front of him. But they were yet a long way in front of him, and until he reached them he had hundreds of miles of travel over level country. It was there, if anywhere, that he must catch up with his schedule and start accumulating another surplus. He gave the Comet the gun, and she darted through the air like a thing possessed. She scooted over the Badlands and down into New Mexico. The heat was oppressive, but the air stirred up by the plane made it bearable, though Ted was suffering tortures from thirst. He was faint, too, from hunger. But all these physical sufferings were as nothing, lost in the fever that consumed him to finish his race in triumph. And he was winning. His heart sang with exultation. The comet was flying as she had never before. For hours now she had made almost 200 miles for every 60 minutes that passed. She was splitting the atmosphere like an arrow. She was fairly eating up space. All the deficit had been wiped out, and Ted Scott was 150 miles to the good. Then the air grew chillier, and Ted knew that his greatest danger was at hand. He was nearing the Rockies. Chapter 25. The Rockies, those grim sentinels of the western part of the continent, those towering peaks capped with eternal snows, those treacherous gorges, dangerous for an airman to attempt to cross at any time, doubtably terribly dangerous at night. Ted Scott throttled down to 3/4 speed and sought altitude. Up, up, he went, until he had reached a height of 12,000 feet. There was no moon, or his task would have been easier. He was flying blind, depending wholly on his instruments. He had flown for possibly half an hour when he struck an air pocket and dropped like a stone for 2,000 feet. It took only a few moments, but it seemed an eternity to the young aviator before he could get a grip on the air and began again his ascent. A little later he encountered a downward draft as he was flying over the gorges, and it was only by superb airmanship that he escaped being dashed against a peak whose outline he could barely discern as he capped it. He must give himself a better margin, and he shot up until he reached an altitude of 17,000 feet. But this, though it lowered the dangers of collision, had its own perils, for the air was so rarefied that he could scarcely breathe. His lungs were laboring with the effort. He began to feel dizzy and lightheaded. He had recourse to the oxygen tank that he had brought along with a view to just such an occasion, and this, though it was annoying and cumbrous, relieved him for the moment. He comforted himself with the reflection that he would not have to endure it for long. As soon as he should reach the farther slope of the range, he could afford to dispense with it. The air became intensely cold, and Ted shivered within his thick clothing. There was over 100 degrees difference between that atmosphere and the sweltering heat of the plains of New Mexico. Something began to beat against the windows of the cockpit. Sleet and hail threatened to break the glass. A fierce wind accompanied it, blowing directly into the teeth of the plane. A few minutes later, Ted found himself in the midst of a howling blizzard. It shrieked like a demon and tore at the plane as though it would rip it to matchwood. For the howling and the cold, Ted Scott cared nothing. What did alarm him seriously was the lack of buoyancy of the plane. It was lumbering along like a bird with crippled wings. He knew too well the reason. It was the same peril that had threatened him on his trip across the Atlantic. The sleet had formed on the wings and was bearing them down. Lower and lower the plane descended. The young aviator strove desperately to maintain his altitude, but to no avail. A little lower and he would be beneath the level of the highest peaks, and at any moment might crash into one of them head-on. He had one resource left, and he was rather reluctant to test it. In building the Comet, he had wires inserted running along the wings through which an electric current could be sent, with the idea of furnishing warmth enough to melt the sleet and ice. It had been installed with great care, but there was always the possible danger of the insulation proving imperfect, or of a short circuit, a danger increased in this case by the previous damage to the wing, and the wrenches both wings had endured in the gales. If such injury existed, the wing might catch on fire. There was no help for it, however, and Ted Scott took the chance. To his delight, it worked. The sleet gradually melted away, and the Comet, released from the burden, again shot up above the danger line. It was a danger averted, but it brought its penalties, for during the time it had taken to accomplish it, the plane had made but little progress. As a matter of fact, it had lost, for the blizzard had driven it off course. Again that precious surplus had been wiped out, and a deficit had taken its place. But the highest part of the range had now been passed. The new altimeter that Ted had installed told him that the distance between him and the Earth was constantly increasing. Ted knew, therefore, that the mountains were sloping downwards. He would soon be over level ground again. There would be other high places to cross, but not so many and not so perilous. He could straighten out on the last lap of his journey to Los Angeles. Now, too, the night was passing. In the east, the clouds were turning from black to a dim gray. The rosy fingers of dawn were beginning to reach up over the horizon. It was an incalculable relief for the young airman not to have to rely any longer on his instruments. Now he could see where he was going, and his spirits rose as the light grew stronger. In that growing light he caught sight of two planes coming in his direction. At first he thought they might be the vanguard of the planes sent out to meet him as a token of honor. In his distinguished career he had become used to such curiosities. But he dismissed that thought as soon as it was conceived. He was too far from his journey's end for that. Los Angeles was still hundreds of miles away. That the pilots of the oncoming planes had seen the pilot was evident by the fact that they changed their line of course and converged towards him on either side. Coming near enough to say hello, thought Ted to himself. Then the thought of that misadventure on the way to Boston occurred to him. He snatched up his glasses and studied the planes. He noticed that each had several men. This was in itself unusual. The planes, too, had no markings. That was still more unusual. Honest men do not try to conceal their identity. They were heavy planes also, while his own was built for speed. In the event of a collision, he would be far more likely to be the sufferer. They were converging closely now, as though to crowd him off his course, deprive him of steerage way, press him down into a landing. He dropped his glasses, picked up his shotgun, and waved it at them. "Keep off!" he yelled. A pistol cracked and the bullet whistled past his head so closely that he could feel the wind of it. Instantly, Ted fired at the nearer plane. There was a yell of pain and the pilot relinquished his hold of the stick and nursed a wounded hand. Ted swung his weapon around and let the second plane have the other barrel. Again there were shouts of anger or excitement, and the occupants were thrown into confusion. They had not anticipated such a hot reception by their intended victim. Ted, with a lightning-like motion, pulled the stick, and the Comet shot upward. Shots flew after the plane, and one of the bullets embedded itself in the fuselage. A moment later, Ted was beyond range and laying his course straight as a die towards Los Angeles. One of the planes attempted to follow, but there was no more chance of catching up with the Comet than a tortoise would have of overtaking a deer. Ted had soon lost the pursuing plane over the horizon. So even up to the last his enemies were trying to defeat him. They had guessed as to his probable course, and had taken a chance on finding him. Well, they had found him, Ted said to himself grimly, and were none too pleased with the finding. He wondered how greatly they had been injured. He knew that small shot at that distance could not kill, but could be very painful. He chuckled at the thought of the thugs digging the pellets out of various parts of their persons. He hoped it would take them a good long time. But his chuckles died away as he estimated the distance that yet remained to be traversed and the time he had left to do it in. No more talk of 150 miles an hour. An exclamation of dismay rose to his lips. The various mishaps and delays that he had encountered had put him so far behind that he would have to average 203 miles an hour to win. Could he do it? Would the gallant plane respond to such a tremendous call upon its powers? He had reached that point in occasional bursts of speed, but only for a few minutes. Would he dare risk that speed for the entire distance that remained? Could the Comet stand the strain? She must! It would be maddening to lose the race on this very last lap. Yet he would lose it if he were even 1 minute overtime. Some way, somehow, he must beat that last fatal minute. He eased the throttle up to full speed and kept it there. And then there was such a flying as California had never seen. Over the orange groves, over the smiling fields, over the silver rivers, the Comet shot with engines roaring. On she went like a streak of lightning. Ted had left Boston at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. 20 hours flying time would mean reaching Los Angeles at 11 o'clock the next morning, Boston time. But as the time between the coast had a difference of 3 standard hours, it meant that it would be 8 o'clock Los Angeles time when he must reach the city. On sped the plane like a meteor shooting across the sky. She was quivering beneath the pressure of the engines and threatening to fly apart. But Ted, crouching low in the cockpit to offer as little resistance to the wind as possible, kept her at full throttle. He must win, for himself, for Walter Hapworth, for Paul Monet, for thousands, perhaps millions, who had wagered on his skill and daring, for the discomfiture of Dago Dan and his confederates, the thugs, the Gales, all the scoundrels who had sought his undoing. 190, 195, 200, 205, 210, 215, and there the figures remained stationary. The comet had reached her limit. No, not quite. Enough to win, perhaps, but Ted Scott did not want to win by an eyelash. He tapped the special tank he held in reserve for especially high-powered gas. He did not dare use it often, but he was going to use it now. The effect was almost instantaneous. The comet leapt as though she had been struck. Her speed was now hair-raising. Up crept the figures. 217, 220. Now the city of Los Angeles was in sight. 222, 225. It was at 227 miles an hour that Ted Scott shot into the sky above the Los Angeles flying field and brought the comet to a perfect landing. He had won the race against time from coast to coast with 22 minutes to spare. Ted stepped out of the cockpit to be fairly swamped by the immense crowd that had been waiting there since dawn for the sighting of his plane. Everyone was trying at once to get near enough to touch his hand or pat his shoulder. It was all the police could do by forming a flying wedge to get him through the throng, almost insane with excitement at the wonderful exploit. Within 5 minutes the news had been flashed to every part of America that its idol had once more triumphed and in making the best time between the oceans that had ever been made by a man. But the tribute paid Ted Scott in Los Angeles, great as it was nothing to the overwhelming greeting that welcomed him on his return to Bromville. There, people from all over the state had assembled to do him homage, and the little city itself was bursting with pride and joy. That Ted should enjoy the ovation was simply saying that he was human, but the clamor of the crowds was nothing to him compared to his joy in meeting those who were especially dear to his heart. Eben, Charity, how dear old Charity hugged him and wept happily over him. "I was praying for you day and night, Ted," she said. "I know it, Mother," replied Ted, his voice husky with emotion as he held her form close to him. "And believe me, there were times when I needed your prayers." Walter Hapworth and Mr. Monet were enthusiastic in their own congratulations. "I knew you'd do it, Ted," cried Walter as he shook his hands. "You've never disappointed me, and how we've cleaned up on it. 10,000 for you and 15,000 apiece for Paul and me. Won't that crowd of golf players be sore when they have to shell out? But I tell you straight, Ted, I'd rather have lost every cent I put up than to have had anything happen to you." "I know that, Walter," replied Ted, as he tightened his grip on his friend's hand. "We haven't been idle while you were gone," put in Paul Monet with a smile. "We've landed the Gales in jail." "Is that so?" exclaimed Ted. "The whole lot of 'em," declared Mr. Monet. "One of their confederates, what is it you Americans say, peached on them in regard to the bomb explosion. Of course the Gales denied it, but the evidence was so strong they've been arrested and held for trial." "Well, I guess they've reached the end of their rope," put in Walter Hapworth, "and a good thing it will be for the community. They've been an evil influence here for years, but I won't be wholly satisfied unless Dago Dan and his tools can be rounded up." This latter proved a difficult task, but it was accomplished at last, and the unprincipled scoundrel, who, as Walter Hapworth had surmised, was the head of a nationwide gambling ring, was convicted of having instigated the Boston kidnapping and given a long term in prison. His tools received a lighter sentence, and some who turned state's evidence were let go altogether. The proof against the Gales was strong enough to convince a jury that there was no doubt of their guilt, and they were sentenced to several years' imprisonment. "I've had a lot of fun out of this coast-to-coast race," remarked Ted to Walter Hapworth one day, before the head of the gambling ring had been captured. "But there's one thing needed to make my happiness complete." "What is that, Greedy?" "5 minutes alone with Dago Dan," replied Ted Scott. And that's the end. So there we go. Our hero made it across the country with 22 minutes to spare out of the 20 hours allotted. I hope you've enjoyed this book. It's kind of been a fun one. Lots of cliffhangers and excitement. Well, we are now approaching the Christmas season and are in the season of Advent. So starting with the next Tuesdays with the Pilgrim, we'll be having some short Christmas stories. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.